I arrived in Stonemaier late on a Saturday afternoon, the last threads of daylight fading into the folds of the Appalachian Mountains. The drive had been long, and my phone signal had died miles before I reached the town. Stonemaier was barely a dot on the map, a few scattered homes, one general store, and an old white church with peeling paint. My plan was simple: photograph the abandoned cemetery at the edge of town for a local history project. The woman at the general store didn't seem pleased when I asked for directions. "You don't want to be wandering up there after sundown," she said, her voice low, her fingers drumming nervously on the counter. "Ground ain't right on that hill. Folks don't last long if they linger." I laughed awkwardly, trying to make light of it, but her expression stayed cold and unreadable. By the time I reached Stonemaier Cemetery, the sun was bleeding out behind the trees, turning the pines into black silhouettes against an orange-gray sky. The place was silent, except for the faint rustle of leaves. The gates were old wrought iron, the paint chipped and flaking. A crooked sign hung from one hinge, barely legible: Stonemaier Cemetery Est 1872. Soon as I stepped inside, the air changed. It smelled like damp earth and rust, and the silence was almost heavy, pressing against my ears. The gravestones were worn down by time, names eroded, dates barely visible. Some were tilted at odd angles, half swallowed by the ground. Towering pines cast long, broken shadows across the moss-covered paths. I set up my tripod and began snapping pictures, trying to ignore the growing unease crawling under my skin. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. Several of the older gravestones had deep, deliberate carvings, not names, but symbols. They were crude shapes, spirals intersected by jagged lines, like something you'd see scratched into wood by someone desperate. The second thing I noticed was the sound. At first, I thought it was just wind moving through the trees, but the noise had weight to it, soft, uneven footsteps crunching dead pine needles somewhere behind me. I turned quickly. I tried to shake it off and kept photographing, but the unease kept building. The longer I stayed, the more I noticed a faint, steady vibration beneath my boots, like something deep below was shifting, breathing. And then, as the last of the daylight slipped away, I realized I wasn't alone. I turned on my flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness, and immediately felt exposed. Every tree, every leaning gravestone cast jagged shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The footsteps were gone now, replaced by something worse: silence so complete it rang in my ears. Then came the vibration again. This time, I crouched and pressed my hand to the ground. It wasn't thunder, it was rhythmic, almost like breathing. I told myself it had to be pipes, or underground water, or maybe just my imagination. But when I tried to take another photo, my camera froze mid-click and power down. I pulled out my phone to check the time. Dead battery. I charged it fully before leaving. That's when I saw the lights, faint glimmers between the trees, small and pale, like lanterns floating low to the ground. They swayed gently, moving deeper into the cemetery, drawing me toward them without a sound. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, but something about the lights felt deliberate, like they were waiting for me. I followed. The deeper I went, the older the gravestones became. Some were so weathered they had no names at all, just blank slabs of stone. And then I found the hollow. It was a shallow depression in the earth, maybe 30 feet wide, with no gravestones at all. The soil looked freshly disturbed, damp and dark, as if someone had just dug it. I stepped closer, shining my light across the hollow. That's when I saw the marks: deep, ragged grooves in the dirt, leading upward. Something had clawed its way out. I turned back toward the floating lights, but they were already fading, one by one, until only darkness remained. My flashlight flickered, struggling against the oppressive black. The air felt heavier now, as though the ground itself was holding its breath. I started walking back the way I came, but the paths all looked wrong. The trees pressed in closer, the gravestones leaned at strange angles, and the familiar wrought iron gate was nowhere to be found. That's when I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard my name, soft and deliberate, carried from somewhere deep between the pines. I froze. The whisper came again, closer this time, and beneath my feet, faint scratching sounds rose up through the soil, like fingernails raking against wood. I backed away slowly, scanning the darkness, until my beam of light caught something moving between the graves. It was pale, too pale. Thin arms, long fingers, hair matted with dirt. It crouched low to the ground, half hidden behind a headstone, staring at me with hollow, dark pits where eyes should have been, and then it was gone. I ran, but no matter how far I went, the cemetery only seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The whispers were everywhere now. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the ground beneath me moving, pulsing like a heartbeat. My hands dug into damp earth, clawing for stability as the hollow trembled violently, and then silence. No whispers, no movement, just stillness. I thought maybe it was over, until I heard the first breath, ragged and wet, directly behind me. I turned, but there was nothing there. The soil beneath me collapsed, and I fell into cold, suffocating darkness. When I came to, I was lying on damp stone, deep underground. Carvings covered the walls, the same spirals and jagged symbols from the gravestones above. Faint light filtered from somewhere unseen, just enough to make out dozens of broken coffins, their lids shattered, and among them, something was moving. I never made it out of Stonemaier Cemetery. At least not all of me. I reached Black Hollow late in the afternoon, the mountains folding in around me as my GPS signal died for the third time that day. The narrow road wound endlessly through thick forest, sunlight breaking through in thin, fractured beams. My car rattled as the pavement gave way to gravel, and soon I was crawling along a dirt path barely wide enough for one vehicle. When I finally spotted the cemetery gates, I almost drove past them. The wrought iron was rusted nearly orange, bent in places like something heavy had tried to force its way in or out. A faded sign above read, Black Hollow Cemetery Est. 1843, parked by the roadside and grabbed my camera bag, taking a deep breath. The air smelled of damp moss and old wood. Just as I approached the gates, a voice stopped me. You shouldn't be here. An old man stood leaning against the fence, his frame thin but rigid, his pale blue eyes locked on me. His clothes were worn, covered in dust and pine needles, and his hands were calloused and cracked. I explained I was there to photograph old gravestones for a personal project, but he didn't seem convinced. You need to be gone before dark, he said, his voice low but sharp. People think it's stories. They ain't stories. You hear anything calling your name, you keep walking. You don't look. You don't answer. His words unsettled me, but I managed an awkward laugh. Are you the caretaker here? His eyes narrowed. I keep watch. That's all. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the tree line, leaving me standing there with my camera bag and a growing sense of unease. I pushed the gates open. The hinges screamed like something alive. The deeper I walked into Black Hollow, the quieter it became. No wind, no birdsong, no insects. The silence was unnatural, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I tried to focus on my photography, moving slowly between the gravestones, but something about the way they leaned bothered me. None of them were straight. Some tilted so far they were nearly flat against the ground. Others warped and twisted as if the earth itself had shifted beneath them. I knelt to photograph one particularly old marker. I noticed something carved into its base, not a name or date, but a single word scratched deep into the stone. Stay. Straightened up quickly, my chest tightening. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved between the graves. I swung my flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there, only crooked stones and mist creeping low over the grass. Then came the sound of crying. It was faint at first, like someone trying not to be heard, but it grew clearer, pulling me toward the back of the cemetery. I followed the sound, weaving between headstones, until I reached an open patch near the tree line. The sobbing stopped. There was no one there, and when I turned back toward the gate, my stomach dropped. The path I came from was gone. In its place, an unbroken wall of trees stretched endlessly in every direction. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. Something was standing among the graves, pale and still, watching me from a distance. By now, the last of the light had vanished, and Black Hollow was swallowed in shadow. I gripped my flashlight tight, trying to slow my breathing, when I heard it, my name, spoken softly from somewhere behind me. I spun around. N01, then it came again, closer this time, and followed by something worse. Another voice, deeper, rasping, layered beneath the first. I stumbled backward, my beam slicing across crooked stones and dead trees. That's when I noticed faint shapes forming in the darkness, silhouettes too thin and too long, swaying gently as though breathing. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then died completely. The voices grew louder, overlapping now, dozens of them murmuring words I couldn't understand. I pulled out my phone to use its light-dead battery, though it had been at 80% minutes earlier, and then I saw him. The caretaker stood motionless among the trees, his face pale in the darkness, his eyes fixed on mine. I shouted for help. He didn't move, but I heard his voice anyway, not out loud, but inside my head, as clear as if he were standing next to me. "You need to leave." I tried to shout back, tried to ask how, but my throat locked up, and when I looked again he was gone. I ran until my lungs burned, weaving between gravestones, tripping over exposed roots, desperate for any sign of the gates. But no matter where I turned, I only went deeper. That's when I fell. I hit the ground hard, my hands sinking into damp earth. Beneath me was an open grave, no headstone, no markings, just a raw hole in the soil. Inside was a coffin, old and rotting, its lid splintered and ajar. I scrambled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, when the whispers started again. Louder, clearer now, layered voices calling my name over and over. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness, stepping slowly from behind gravestones. Their movements jerky, unnatural. I couldn't see their faces, only the pale outlines of their bodies, but I felt their eyes on me. I turned and ran. That's when I saw the caretaker one final time, standing at the far end of the cemetery, just beyond the hollow. He raised one hand slowly, pointing at the ground in front of me. I stopped, staring down at my feet. Carved into the dirt were the same words I'd seen before. Stay, and then the earth gave way beneath me. Everything went black. I wasn't planning on finding Wraithwood. I'd been hiking solo for 2 days, following a loosely marked trail that looped through the Appalachian foothills. My goal was simple: get good landscape shots for a local photography project. That morning, fog had rolled in heavy, clinging low between the trees. By noon, I realized I'd taken a wrong turn. My GPS was useless, the signal kept cutting in and out, so I followed what looked like an old deer path downhill, hoping to reconnect with the main trail. That's when I found the road. It was narrow, little more than packed dirt, almost hidden beneath a tangle of overgrown weeds and vines. What caught my attention, though, was the way the trees curved around it unnaturally, their trunks bent as if forced aside. I checked my map, nothing. This road didn't exist. Curiosity got the better of me. I followed it. After maybe 10 minutes, the forest opened into a clearing, and there it was, Wraithwood Cemetery. There was no gate, no fence, no sign, just rows of ancient gravestones, most leaning, many broken, half swallowed by roots and moss. The air was still, unnervingly still. Even the usual drone of cicadas was absent, and the silence pressed against my ears. I knelt by the nearest stone, brushing away damp leaves, but the name was unreadable, carved too shallow and worn away by time. Then I noticed something else. Most of the graves weren't marked at all, just mounds of earth, arranged in uneven rows, as though someone had buried them in haste. I raised my camera to take a shot, and that's when I first heard it, a faint exhale, soft and wet, directly behind me. I turned sharply. N01 there. I moved slowly through the cemetery, weaving between tilted markers and clusters of dead cedars, every sound magnified by the silence. The deeper I went, the worse the gravestones looked. Entire names were gone, eaten away by time or stripped intentionally. leaving behind smooth, blank faces of stone. Some markers bore deep scratches, long grooves like claw marks, while others were cracked clean down the middle. One was so badly burned around the edges it looked like it had been set on fire, though there was no sign of charring anywhere else in the area. I knelt by one of the intact stones and brushed away dirt. The name had been crudely crossed out, replaced by a strange carved symbol, a circle cut clean in half by a jagged line. I checked another, then another. Same mark. I tried to photograph them, but my camera froze, screen flashing before powering down completely. Annoyed, I reached for my phone, but it wouldn't turn on either. Both devices had been fully charged an hour earlier. That's when I heard it, faint whispers threading between the trees, too soft to make out but rhythmic, steady. I stood up fast, scanning the cemetery. The whispers stopped, and in that sudden silence, I noticed something I hadn't before. Between the gravestones, barely visible beneath fallen leaves, the ground was marked with shallow indentations, like handprints pressed into the soil. Fresh ones. Whoever or whatever made them was still here. The handprints led me past the last row of gravestones to an enormous cedar towering over the rest. Its roots bulged from the ground like thick, skeletal arms, splitting several graves apart, and the earth around its base looked darker, freshly disturbed. I crouched to examine the soil. It was damp and soft, sinking slightly beneath my fingertips. That's when I heard it, knocking, slow, steady, muffled. I pressed my ear closer to the ground, holding my breath. The sound was coming from beneath the cedar roots. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 more. It wasn't random. I stumbled back, hard hammering, when the roots shifted. Not a lot, just enough to release a faint creak, like wood twisting under pressure. I froze. That's when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Someone or something crouched behind the cedar, partially hidden in shadow. I raised my flashlight and caught a glimpse of pale skin, too pale, almost gray, stretched tight across a gaunt frame. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and where its eyes should have been were 2 dark, wet hollows. Then it dropped lower, disappearing behind the tree. I didn't follow. I ran until my lungs burned, but no matter which direction I chose, I always ended up back at the cedar tree. The whispers were louder now, overlapping voices hissing my name from every direction, some near, some impossibly far. The knocking beneath the roots became pounding, the ground trembling with each strike. I fell to my knees, clutching the dirt, trying to steady myself. That's when I tripped over something, a long, splintered board sticking halfway out of the soil. I pulled it free and realized it was an old coffin lid, warped and cracked with age. I looked around and froze. Dozens more surrounded me, half buried, scattered across the ground like discarded shells, but there were no coffins and no remains. Nothing had ever been put in the ground, and then the soil beneath me shifted, heaving upward, and I realized my mistake. These weren't graves. The mounds weren't for burying. They were for holding something in. The last thing I heard before the ground split open was my own name, whispered from below. I moved to Boone County, West Virginia, in early autumn of 2018, chasing a new job and, if I'm honest, a quieter life. I'd grown tired of constant traffic, crowds, and the background hum of the city. Here, the night stretched on for miles, silent and still, the air crisp and heavy with the smell of pine. The locals were polite but private, never sharing more than they needed to. They warned me about the weather, the winding backroads, and the occasional black bear. But there was one thing no one mentioned: Black Hollow Cemetery. I found it by accident. It was a Friday night, late October. I'd stayed after hours at work finishing paperwork, and by the time I left, the rain had started to fall in a steady drizzle. My usual route home was blocked by a fallen tree, so I let my GPS guide me. It rerouted me through a narrow side road I'd never noticed before, unmarked and flanked by towering pine trees. The deeper I drove, the more the rain seemed to drown out every other sound, until it felt like I was underwater. Then my GPS froze. No signal, slow to a crawl, my headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. The road twisted sharply downhill, roots clawing up through the cracked asphalt. That's when I saw it, the weathered wooden sign nailed to a leaning post. Black Hollow Cemetery Est. 1874. I remember the chill that crept up my neck then. Something about the silence around that sign felt unnatural. No insects, no birds, just rain hitting leaves. I considered turning back, but the road was too narrow, and the trees pressed in tightly on either side. I eased forward, then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement in the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, but as my headlights swept across the trunks, I saw the outline of something tall and pale moving between them. My stomach dropped when I realized it was walking upright, and it was keeping pace with my car. The next morning, I couldn't shake the unease. At the local diner, I asked Sarah, the waitress who usually refilled my coffee, if she knew anything about Black Hollow Cemetery. The reaction was immediate. Her hand froze halfway to the pot, and her gaze darted toward an older man sitting near the counter. He shook his head slowly. Sarah cleared her throat and said flatly, "Ain't nothin' out there worth your time." When I pressed further, her voice dropped. "Best you stay away from them woods. Folks don't talk about Black Hollow." I laughed awkwardly, trying to lighten the mood. "Why? Is it haunted or something?" The older man spoke then, his voice low and rasping. "Not haunted. Watched." I waited for him to explain, but he just stared into his coffee until I left. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house made me sit up in bed. Around a.m., I heard something outside, soft, deliberate footsteps on wet leaves. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the smell of earth. I shone the beam across my yard, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh, muddy prints leading from the tree line to the base of my porch steps. Bare footprints. I didn't sleep at all after that. By Sunday morning, I'd convinced myself I had to see the place in daylight. I drove back down the winding road until the sign came into view, weathered and darkened by age. I parked off to the side and stepped out, my boots sinking into damp soil. The air smelled of rot and wet moss, and the silence was absolute. The cemetery itself was small, maybe 50 graves scattered across uneven ground. Most of the stones were crumbling, names eroded away by time, but some were pristine, newer, almost too new. And then I noticed something stranger. There were symbols carved into several of the headstones. Not crosses, not anything I recognized. Sharp, angular shapes that seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic. I felt watched. I turned, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw him. A man, or at least, I thought it was a man standing behind a crypt. He was tall, dressed entirely in black, and wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. At first, I thought he was a groundskeeper, but when he stepped forward, the light hit him, and my breath caught. There was nothing where his face should have been, just smooth, pale skin stretching from chin to forehead. I stumbled back, my boots slipping on wet grass. When I looked again, he was gone. I didn't go back to the cemetery after that, but the cemetery came back to me. That night, I woke around a.m. to the sound of scratching, faint but steady against my bedroom window. I froze, heart pounding, and strained to listen. Then came soft, deliberate footsteps across the porch. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. When the sound stopped, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. But the next morning, I found something outside my door, a single, damp footprint. Bare, human, drove straight to the diner, stormed inside, and demanded answers. The older man from before was there. He looked at me with something like pity. "You saw him," he said. "Who?" "The keeper." I swallowed hard. "What does he want?" He shook his head. "Don't want nothin'. He just marks you." I wanted to scream at him, demand more, but he just stood up, tossed a few bills on the counter, and left without another word. That night, the noises came back, louder this time, walking circles around the house, soft knocks on the walls, faint whispers I couldn't understand. And then, around a.m., I heard it, the floorboards inside my hallway creaking. I grabbed my flashlight, trembling, and turned toward my bedroom door. The beam illuminated the hall just in time to see a tall, pale figure step into the shadows. I didn't hear the door open. I didn't hear footsteps leave, but right now, as I write this, I can hear slow, deliberate breathing just behind me.